about today is a bit of work that I'm particularly interested in, is exploring kind of what makes our species unique. And I want to put forward, it's not necessarily a new idea, but putting forward a kind of focus on the ecological environmental characteristics of our species compared to some of its closest relatives, and argue that that is one of the key things we should be looking out for. Oh, okay. There we go. So lots of different things have been used to define our species. Perhaps the most obvious one in a paleoanthropological context is our fossils, where they turn up. So, you know, the idea of a classic Homo sapiens skull shape, for example, that people like Chris Stringer, who I've seen in the audience, have obviously spent their careers defining, and how this has emerged from earlier ancestors and things like that. Now, that's great, but one of the problems is that it's very hard to find these fossils. Firstly, they're obviously incredibly rare, but B, as Chris and his colleagues, and particularly this paper by Ellie Sherry et al. Have been pointing out, well, actually, this doesn't happen particularly instantaneously. That actually, even the fossil evolution of our species in Africa appears to be a product of lots of different populations coming together, the sort of multi-regional model within Africa, if you like, and so that makes it hard to some extent to pinpoint sort of when our species emerges necessarily in a particularly fossil context. What about the genetics then? Obviously, massive strides have been made in terms of ancient DNA analysis. The ability to extract genomes from ancient fossils has obviously been massive in the field of archaeology and paleoanthropology, and it's shown quite incredible things in terms of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and other species of hominin, such as Neanderthals and Denisovans, for example, as well as potentially other, including Homo erectus and so-called ghost populations. And this is only likely to become even more complex as we find more fossils, such as, in Southeast Asia, such as Homo luzonensis. That's a very recent find. But again, the fact that these species are being shown to interbreed is potentially problematic for defining our species genetically. A, does that mean then that these aren't different species and we're all part of the same species in a biological sense? Or if, as the geneticists tend to put forward, that there is still enough variability that we are clearly distinct species, then that still makes it somewhat cloudy waters in terms of how we're defining the exact appearance of our species. And again, of course, it relies on the fossils that we just touched upon earlier. So obviously, the other way that archaeologists have turned to is material culture, because it's far more abundant and often preserved in many more places, therefore perhaps giving a better or bigger data set with which to determine when certain behavioral characteristics linked to our species might have emerged. So for example, here on the left, you can see some of the kind of classic Blombos cave assemblages in South Africa, the sort of earliest artwork on ochre, bone tool technology, personal ornamentation and things like that, as well as other people have argued, particularly John Shea, that perhaps the bow and arrow is a distinctive characteristic of our species, and that's what really allowed us to migrate around the planet. But again, the problem is that A, it's going to be very difficult for us to find the earliest examples of some of these, because they're all organic technologies, which means we're very unlikely to ever find the first. But also that it's been shown that these different traits that were once linked very definitively to our species have A, sort of come and gone in the archaeological record in different places, but B, that other species of hominin, such as Neanderthals and recently Homo erectus, might have been able to do some of these things as well. So that then means, again, it's slightly problematic perhaps to use these in isolation for defining when our species appears. And so what I want to argue is that perhaps the best place to look, and this is not necessarily a new argument, but is in the environmental and ecological context of our species. But it's been something that's often neglected, particularly as we see nature papers on genomes, on early fossils, and on early particular types of material culture in a certain region or an early date. Often what I find is markedly lacking is a kind of environmental context for these finds, which I would argue is actually one of the most important aspects of this. So just to take two of these recent examples of early fossil finds. So for example, the earliest Homo sapiens fossil outside of Africa is now thought to be in Israel at Mizleah Cave. But also more recently, there's been findings in Greece as well. And particularly in the Mizleah example, there was no real reference, at least in that particular first paper, although the work may be ongoing, in relation to the environment. But I would argue that that is one of the most important things we want to know about when we're looking at these early dispersals, because political boundaries obviously didn't exist in the past, and particularly not in the Pleistocene. And so what we're actually interested in is when these humans moved out of Africa, were they moving into a different environment or not? As you can see from this kind of basic biogeographic map, the movement into the Levant or into the Middle East, if you're already a human population living in Northeast Africa, is not necessarily any more difficult than it would be to move between different parts of Africa, for example. And so should we therefore put a lot of interest in the earliest fossil outside Africa if we don't know the environment that it's being found in? Because it could simply be a basic range expansion that we see with every single species on the planet. And therefore, is that interesting without that information? And this is particularly the case, given that obviously ever since Charles Darwin, the interest in defining species has been based on things such as environmental or geographic isolation. So if we see that as a fundamental process of evolution, that this is how species develop, how adaptations form, then we of course need the environmental and ecological context to back that up and to see how are different homin species, if they're different species or not, are evolving and what are they adapting to. So I think this has been something of a gap, at least in some of these papers. And I think what's interesting and is really the smoking gun is that currently our species seems to have been the only hominin that could occupy all of these different environments. Obviously it does today, but even during the late Pleistocene, a lot of evidence that I'm now gonna sort of review for you shows that our species, even in the late Pleistocene, was already inhabiting some of these more what we might call extreme environments. And that for other hominin species, whether that's Homo neanderthalensis or Homo erectus, don't seem to have been inhabiting these types of environments, at least based on the evidence we have so far. And so this seems to be a very productive way or perhaps area in looking when we think about what makes our species unique and how it ended up developing these adaptations. And so in 2018, myself and my colleague, Brian Stewart at the University of Michigan, put forward this idea, but really it was built on a lot of work, such as Peter Domenical, Matt Grove, and of course, Potts' study into variability, in this argument that perhaps what makes our species most unique is its plasticity, whether that's adaptations to increasing climatic variation in the late Pleistocene, or its ability, and particularly what we wanted to highlight, its ability in adapting to lots of different environments very quickly. And we came up with this jargonistic term called the generalist specialist. And what we meant by that was that other hominins, particularly Homo erectus, have been shown to be generalists. So if we think of a generalist like a macaque monkey, for example, they can inhabit lots of different environments that as a species as a whole can inhabit a variety of different environments. In contrast to a specialist such as the giant panda that is obviously very specific in the niche that it occupies. But we wanted to argue that actually this doesn't seem to quite cut it for Homo sapiens. It wouldn't do it justice to just call it a generalist. Because actually what we see is as Homo sapiens is moving around the planet in the late Pleistocene, different populations of Homo sapiens are beginning to specialize in certain environments. And some of these are quite extreme. So whether that's tropical rainforests, high altitude settings, or deserts, we see that localized populations of Homo sapiens are becoming very well tuned, often over long periods of time, to these different environments. And so we argued that a term, sort of the generalist specialist, captured this a little more, so that not only is our species as a whole inhabiting all of these different environments, but particular populations of this species are also being able to specialize. And so now what I want to do is just sort of run through the existing evidence for ecological and environmental adaptations, both for some of our closest relatives within the genus Homo, but also then our species, to see whether, does this idea hold up? Are we unique ecologically? So to start with sort of non-Homo sapiens adaptations, if you like, the Neanderthals have often been classically considered as being adapted to the cold extremes because of their sort of body shape on the one hand, and ideas that they're living through very tough glacial conditions in Eurasia. But when we actually dig into the ecological and paleoenvironmental information found within Neanderthal sites, what we see is that actually they're, for the most part, inhabiting various mosaics of woodland and grassland environments. Now, these are obviously very different. This is not to say that all of these environments are the same, and Homo neanderthalensis was clearly able to adapt to very different scenarios. But as a broader sort of context, whether it's a slightly more arid woodland and grassland in a Mediterranean region, or whether it's a cooler grassland woodland mosaic further in northern latitudes, we generally see that there is this sort of ability, or that there's this access to these different types of resources. Of course, more recently, we've also seen that Neanderthals, there's lots of evidence for them using marine resources, and perhaps even diving to deep depths to procure them. So this does complicate the picture slightly, and they were clearly very flexible in what they were doing. But if you look at the terrestrial environmental evidence to date, we would argue that this indicates that broadly they have a preference for kind of mosaic environments that they can use lots of different things from. Another set of non-Homo sapiens hominins are, of course, the Homo erectus and later the Homo floresiensis fossils found in Southeast Asia. Now, early on, this seemed quite miraculous that Homo erectus was getting into a region that was thought to be covered in tropical rainforest environments at the time, perhaps suggesting really quite a sophisticated adaptation when it arrived there. So even with Homo floresiensis being found on the island of Flores, the kind of small stature of these hominins was also taken to perhaps be an adaptation to humid, resource-poor rainforest environments on this island. But again, when we actually turn to the paleoenvironmental and the zooarchaeological evidence associated with both Homo erectus and Homo floresiensis, we see that actually in both cases, again, it seems to be mixtures of sort of grassland, woodland environments. And while there might be some elements of rainforest fauna found in the vicinity, it's certainly only in the form of patches. And so again, we see that in general, these hominins are preferring to keep a more mosaic access to different types of resources. But again, not to say that they're not obviously doing incredibly complex things, but just as a broader perspective, this seems to be the environmental preference. And as I'll come on to a bit later, it's even been argued that Homo erectus disappears, particularly now we know it sort of has a late survival date to around 100,000 years ago, that it only disappears as tropical rainforests are expanding across the late Pleistocene from about 100 to 80,000 years ago as well. And so it's been argued that this even shapes the fossil record of these hominins in Southeast Asia. Denisovans is obviously a bit more complex and far more recently known hominin, but initially based on this finger bone from Denisova cave. I'm sure you've all heard of it. Given our relative lack of fossil insights into Denisovans, it can often be difficult to determine their exact ecological and environmental behaviors. More recently, there has been this paper that I'm sure you all read about, which found a Denisovan at potentially a high altitude environment. And also we know that I'll come on to a bit later, that genetically it seems that many people living in this part of the world, in Tibet, and actually share genetic adaptations to high altitude environments that seem to have come from Denisovans. It's also been argued that the fact that Denisovan interbreeding has occurred and there's a higher proportion of Denisovan DNA in Southeast Asian and near Oceanian populations also indicates that perhaps Denisovans were hanging around in sort of the tropics of Southeast Asia and near Oceania as well. So this might suggest that there is another hominin that is adapting to more extreme environments. But again, at the same time, there's still no direct evidence for this. We don't have any good paleoenvironmental records that show Denisovans were doing this particularly. And there are potentially some question marks over this high altitude area, especially given that the jaw was found by a monk and not actually excavated from the region, and also relative changes in uplift as well. And so I think there's still work to be done, although it does seem that this might be an interesting avenue for looking for another hominin that might have very interesting adaptations. So now I just want to move on to our species then and compare it to these non-Homo sapiens examples of ecological environmental adaptations. Now, where this all started for me personally was looking at this question of tropical rainforests that for so long have been considered as sort of barriers to human activity. We often think of them in popular culture as being areas like, you know, for example, the Jungle Book, where you're living wild, that there are ruins, that humans really shouldn't be living there. And this has also been, I would say, a popular stereotype in academic circles as well, that particularly when talking about dispersals, that humans would have avoided these kind of environments and ideally expanded into areas of the tropics when climate changed and led to slightly more open environments. And this is perhaps not surprising, given that this is just an example from one of my colleagues who does fieldwork in Kalimantan. You can see just how difficult it is even for us to go and do fieldwork in these places, right? You might have to take a boat down a river and then trek through relatively inaccessible rainforests. And this has also inhibited a lot of work being done there. It means that the fossil record and the archaeological record from these areas has also been relatively limited until recently. And so when we're looking at our species, often it's been associated with either more open environments, kind of latching onto this ongoing discussion in hominin evolution that it's really driven by an adaptation to more open environments, or when looking at this early material culture on the South African and now the North African and also the East African coast, that our species developed its kind of perhaps unique behaviors thanks to rich marine resources. That's been a hypothesis. And that also it might have migrated very quickly to Australia thanks to following very rich marine habitats and resources around the Indian Ocean rim. And so all of this has led to really tropical forests being marginalized in these discussions. And yet back in 2015, when myself and my former supervisor, Michael Petraglia, did a review of sites, it was very clear that there were lots of late Pleistocene sites in tropical rainforest environments. And this has only increased. But one of the questions that you can see from this is that while we have these sites in what is today a tropical forest, there's a question as to were they tropical forests in the past, and how might we go about proving that? And so this is what my PhD was really based on, was applying a new methodology, at least in the context of our species. And this was stable isotope analysis. So just to sort of take a backtrack from this broader story for a minute, this methodology, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, is quite nice because it works on the principle you are what you eat, or at least that's the idea, that by measuring the stable, particularly carbon isotope ratios in tissues, we can determine what a person was relying on in terms of resources. And this basically works by there being two isotopes of the same atoms, and they basically are atoms of the same element that have a different number of neutrons. And what this means is that they behave differently. So for example, the lighter isotope, as you can see in this very sophisticated animation, moves around a bit faster than the heavier isotope. And what this means is that in any given biological, chemical, or physical reaction, they react to different extents as they go through it. And this leads to a different ratio between the lighter and the heavier isotope from the beginning and to the product we end up with at the end. And this is what's expressed in this kind of delta notation, which simply means the ratio of these two isotopes compared to an international standard. It might look a bit complex, but that's literally all that it means. And this value sort of provides us insight into how the ratio of these different isotopes are changing between sort of the things going into a reaction and the things coming out of the other end. And what's really significant for us in a tropical context is that these vary in very predictable ways in plants. And so one example that everyone will be familiar with is that C3 plants, and this just refers to the number of carbons in the first sugar produced in photosynthesis. C3 plants such as wheat have very different carbon isotope values to C4 crops such as maize. But crucially for us, this is not just a case of domesticates. And in the tropics, there generally is a division between tropical forest environments that are dominated by C3 plants, whether that's trees, shrubs, things like that, versus more open grassland or what we might call savanna settings, which tend to be dominated by C4 grasses. And so we can use these isotopic distinctions to try and look at the different environments that were existing in the past, but also the different types of resources that our species or other hominins might have been relying on. And within this big division between C3 and C4, there is also further variation when we only look at C3 plants within forests, for example. The lowest carbon isotope values we see are in plants that live under a dense tropical forest canopy. And this is because shadows and a lack of light impacts the photosynthesis, as does recycled carbon dioxide under the canopy as well. And this leads to even lower carbon isotope values in plants growing under tropical forests than those growing in more open woodland or open forests, or perhaps also higher up in the canopy as well. So you might have heard this primarily being applied to bone collagen in laboratory studies, but when we're talking about these timescales and when we're talking about these extreme environments, it really is tooth enamel that is the material of choice because it is so much more stable. We can analyze it to check how stable it is. And another nice advantage is we can also take sequential samples because the enamel forms in a broadly linear fashion. So we can actually see if the diet and the isotopic values were changing during the period of formation of these teeth. So anyway, we applied this in this, going back to this broader context of trying to see, were humans living in rainforests or not? Were they barriers? And we zoomed in on Sri Lanka in particular, which was a particularly fascinating case because all of the earliest archaeological sites associated with our species were found in what was today a modern rainforest. And so the question then remained, and also with, as you can see here, beautiful material culture that's been published in the last few years, that even indicated bow and arrow technology being used, and also the hunting of monkeys and squirrels. So we knew that they were using rainforest resources, but the question was, how were they relying on them? Were they perhaps moving between different environments in the past, or were perhaps these rainforest environments very different? And so this is where the isotopes came in. And from this plot, I just want, the main thing to focus on is really the carbon isotopes on the bottom. So the lowest towards the left and the highest towards the right. And what you can see is that animals living in the dense wet zone rainforest, which is what you might classically think of as a rainforest, are lower in their carbon isotopes than more drier intermediate rainforest, and much lower than these kind of more open, also grading into C4 grassland environments from the dry zone. And so we can see that this system works in Sri Lanka. So what happens then when we plot the human fossils and also the earlier animals we have onto this? Well, we can see that the earliest human fossil we had at the time, dating to 36,000 years ago at Batatombalena, is in fact found within where we would expect rainforest reliance to be. And what's perhaps even more significant is that the animals found at the time showed that just before the last glacial maximum, these environments were probably drier and more open at the time, and there were other environments available. And yet this human in particular was relying on these rainforest resources for the most part. This broadly continues into the last glacial maximum, but we can see that even further forest drying is leading humans towards the exploitation of intermediate rainforest resources that were a bit drier and more open. A continued reliance on some kind of tropical forest, whether it's a rainforest or an intermediate forest, continues through the terminal Pleistocene, Holocene, and a sort of re-expansion of wetter rainforest. And the one exception that sort of proves this rule is that the only time we see humans living in a sort of savanna context or open grassland context in Sri Lanka is when, in the Iron Age, millet agriculture arrived. Millet is a C4 crop, and agriculture and food production moved into the rainforest area. But even then, you can see that there are still some people relying on rainforest resources as well. And so this really turned over the idea that basically hominins and humans in particular would always go to a savanna environment where they could. What we could actually see in Sri Lanka was that from the beginning, they were very happy using tropical rainforest environments. And so this then basically provided the platform. And then we could see here also that this wasn't just a sort of mixed signal of humans doing very different things, but that rather, even when we did the sequential analysis, we could see that this wasn't really changing through time. This is only the top level is particularly relevant here, but you can see that these values were consistent while these teeth were forming as well. And so this provided a more interesting platform for me to then, go back and see some of these other interesting suggestions of where Homo sapiens have been argued to maybe have adopted tropical rainforest environments. Some of the work I noticed also that Larry Barham is in the audience, and he's obviously been a proponent of potentially very early human adaptations in African rainforests, with certain toolkits such as the Sangoan or Lupemban or whatever you want to call them, being used to extract perhaps root plants from under forest floors, or also potentially being used to hunt forest game. And this has also been then taken on by people like Julio Makeda. And looking at questions, there are sites, right, that are in and around the African rainforest as it exists today. And so the question that exists here then is, was it rainforest in the past? We know probably from climatic models that the forest did really change quite significantly in the past. And the other problem is that most of our environmental information for this time period from about 200,000 through to sort of 40,000 years ago is coming from offshore marine cores, which suggests definitely that there was rainforest around somewhere. But the question remains, was there rainforest where these populations of presumably Homo sapiens were living? And so this remains a very open question. But I think given what we see in Sri Lanka, it's highly likely, for me at least personally, that we will find that Homo sapiens was adapting to these rainforests from an early period. But it remains sort of a bit of an open question. Recently, there has been work, particularly something that I was part of, Pangia Saidi, which is a site on the coast that Kerry Shipton really drove, and I see Jim Bob Blinkhorn was also, and they really drove a lot of the work at this site, where we found that humans in this case were living, although they're on the coast in East Africa, there was no evidence for them using marine resources, apart from for symbolic artifacts. And so what they were using was apparently a mixture of tropical sort of coastal forests and more open grasslands. And that reliance sort of changed through time, but it does seem that they were using resources in tropical forests on the coastal areas. So this is kind of, and there has been a broader discussion of the fact that perhaps corridors of woodland, forest, and grasslands might have provided movements for Homo sapiens at different points through Africa in the Pleistocene. So there does remain some hints, and the human tooth that we did analyze from this site did seem to have a preference for more woodland forest environments. But again, I think there's far more work to be done in Africa looking at these questions of which adaptations did our species have in this sort of period between 200 and 50,000 years ago. Moving to Southeast Asia now, my colleague Julian Lewis and I recently had a paper published looking at the broader view of how environments have changed in Southeast Asia through time. There'd often been this discussion of this kind of so-called savanna corridor, and the idea that hominins moved in when there was a kind of opening of the forest landscapes in the past. And what we found, so we analyzed a lot of modern fauna firstly and compared it to the published literature to see the degree to which forests or the environments that different animals were relying on through time showed this trend. And what we found is even this particular plot is showing you different sort of groups of animals and how they change between the different periods. And what we basically see is that in the early Pleistocene, there seems to be, there is rainforest present, particularly in on the Sunda Shelf region. And then in the middle Pleistocene, we see an expansion of more open savanna context, which continues a little into the middle Pleistocene as well, at which point there's then a transferal back to more closed rainforest habitats. And this is easier to see in this plot, I think, where again, you can see the green are the herbivores, the blue are the omnivores, and the yellow are the carnivores. And what we see is in the early Pleistocene, there is a mixture of environments always available. There is lots of tropical forest in there towards the left-hand side, but there is also some grassland environments in the early Pleistocene. Probably mainly most of these early grasslands are in the Indo-Chinese subregion area. And this then changes in the middle Pleistocene. We see a clear shift in distribution towards more open grassland environments across both regions. And then in the late Pleistocene, it comes back to there being a far greater proportion of rainforest and into the Holocene where it really is dominating the landscape. And we link this back into the discussion I mentioned earlier, that what we see is that Homo erectus comes in when there is a sort of mixture of open environments and forest settings. And then in the middle Pleistocene, we really see these sort of different species of hominins apparently thriving, whether it's Homo erectus, Homo lefrusiensis, and now Homo luzonensis. And then these species then, alongside a lot of other animals that are adapted to open grassland environments, like the stegodon fauna that's often been associated with Homo erectus, then actually all seem to go extinct as forest expands again about 100 to 80,000 years ago. And so we were arguing that this isotopic information fit with this broader idea that there was big faunal turnover linked to abilities to adapt to these different environments. And certainly when we look at our species or sites linked to our species in Southeast Asia, we do see that it looks like Homo sapiens could very much adapt to rainforest environments. One of the classic examples is the Nia Caves in Borneo, where there's a 50,000, 45,000 year record of humans doing very sophisticated things, exploiting toxic plants, hunting wild boar, as well as apes and monkeys. And apparently perhaps even shaping the forest around the site, as Chris Hunt, who's also working in Liverpool, has also been working on. Also, there was a recent suggestion in a Nature paper that the earliest human perhaps dated in Southeast Asia so far is the Lida Adja tooth, although the dating obviously still remains indirect. But if you believe this Nature paper, this would be the earliest human. And there's an argument that that is also associated with rainforest environments. There is, like perhaps in the African context mentioned earlier, there is still some debate because this rainforest adaptation idea is based on an association of this tooth with a lot of orangutan teeth. But because this deposit is basically formed by all of these teeth washing in together, it's hard to tell whether that's a real sort of in vivo association or whether it just happened later. And so without isotopes on the human teeth itself, it's very hard to know whether this certainly did have a rainforest adaptation, although it does seem incredibly likely. Also, as we move out into near Oceania, in New Guinea, we see that humans are also adapting to even the highland tropical rainforests of the region that actually get very cold, particularly at the last glacial maximum, but also in winter. And so I think in this context, we're not only seeing that late Pleistocene humans could very clearly adapt to tropical forest environments, they could also specialize in them. And they could specialize in very different types of tropical forests, from lowland, wet, humid rainforests to highland, cold, tropical rainforests in mountainous regions as well. And so perhaps more recently then, turning our eyes away from rainforests, do we see this evidence in other types of what we might call extreme environments? Do we see that perhaps our species also shows something unique in these other settings? And so to take one example, this is Saudi Arabia, where obviously Mike Petraglia's Paleo Deserts work has been doing a lot of sort of rehabilitating an area that perhaps was ignored largely, again, like tropical forest being considered a sort of blank on an archaeological map. Why would anyone want to inhabit a desert? And yet, all of the survey work they've been doing, also now being driven by Hugh Grucott as well, another Max Planck in Jena, has shown that all these sites exist in across Saudi Arabia, that there are these sites that are dated. What's interesting is that in general, they seem to be linked to periods of time where conditions were wetter, where rain actually shifted, and where you then ended up with a sort of so-called green Arabia, if you like. And so this might then counteract that idea of extreme adaptations if assuming that actually they're moving into an environment that was already there. But here's one example where we tried to test this again using isotopes. This is the site of Tis Al Ghada, which is a very important paleontological site in Saudi Arabia. And here we're going to turn to just oxygen isotopes briefly. So I'm just going to take a step back. Again, the same principle is working, that there are isotopes of the same elements, in this case, oxygen 18 and oxygen 16, and they react again in different ways in different reactions. Here, it's perhaps a little easier to imagine because basically what happens is during evaporation, the lighter isotopes evaporate more quickly than the heavier isotopes, which means that your cloud that forms has lower oxygen isotope values than the ocean that it is formed from, because it has a higher ratio of lighter isotopes to heavier isotopes. And then as these clouds travel inland, the rain, then the opposite happens. So the rain has a greater proportion of heavier oxygen isotopes than lighter isotopes as it falls. And this leaves the cloud with lower oxygen isotope values as the rain falls. And this continues over the landscape, so that the cloud is increasingly becoming lower and lower in oxygen isotope values. So that's the broad hydrological approach. But when we're then considering an area on land, there's a key distinction between what is sort of an open water body that's formed from this rainfall and the plants that are taking up this water. But then they have, again, higher oxygen isotope values because the water is evaporating from their leaves. And again, remember what I said about there's more of the heavier oxygen isotope staying behind and the lighter isotope is leaving, which means that the plant water and the sugars left in the plant have a higher oxygen isotope value than the groundwater that they originally took up. And this increases, and the gap between these two different sources increases as you get things like increasing aridity, increasing temperature. And what's important is that we can actually compare this in different animals. So you might have heard of this sort of difference between obligate and non-obligate drinkers. And so obligate drinkers are like horses, like us. We have to drink our water to get enough. Whereas there are animals like the Arabian oryx, which are non-obligate drinkers. This means that they can get enough water from plants if they have to. And so what's important, though, is that these two different animals have roughly the same body mass, and they're doing these very different drinking strategies and will reflect that isotopic difference between plants and open water that I mentioned earlier. That's not shown up. That's annoying. So there should have been an isotopic figure here, but basically what we found is that at Tis Al Ghada, which is actually associated with hominin activity 300 million years ago, based on cut marks, that at that time, the difference between the obligate and non-obligate drinkers made basically this Tis Al Ghada site had roughly the same levels of aridity as relatively dry savanna settings in East Africa today, which would suggest that the hominins moving in around about 300,000 years ago, which were presumably pre-Homo sapiens hominins, although we can't necessarily rule out that they weren't our species, were moving into an area that was actually very similar to the area they came from. And so this is kind of a nice example where we're able to show that actually, although they're being found in a desert, directly it looks like actually, it was just an increase of range size thanks to these wetter conditions. Matthew Stewart, who's part of Hugh Grucut's group in Jena, is continuing this work, but also looking at Homo sapiens, sites we definitely can link with Homo sapiens. And some of the sort of broader initial looks suggest that some of the environments that our species was occupying when it got into Arabia were slightly more arid than its predecessors. But this is work that's ongoing. Similarly, in North Africa, comparison of records across the Sahara shows that the Sahara was again wet at different points in time, meaning that during the Pleistocene, humans could cross at different points in time. This is from a great paper by Eleanor Sherry, showing these kind of how the tools plot onto these conditions. And again, like Saudi Arabia, these sort of peaks in when occupation sites appear are linked to wetter phases. But again, unfortunately, in this case, we don't have any direct evidence yet. But this remains a potentially interesting avenue of, how green were these deserts at the time? Were they still representing quite a difficult adaptation, or were they just simply allowing a range expansion? I think this is something still up for debate. A lot of this work is still based on broader off-site records and climate models. And there's a real need to get some more on-site data to look at this question. There's been some work in Southern Africa that seems to show that actually Homo sapiens was inhabiting desertic areas in this region when they were actually aridifying. So not at peak water availability, but actually at periods when there was sort of reduced water availability. So that's quite interesting. Is that something that we're going to see elsewhere as well? And this is a work that a lot of work that James Blinkhorn's been doing, driving work in the Thar Desert to see that, were humans adapting to coastal areas as they came in on these supposed sort of coastal routes out of Africa around the Indian Ocean rim? Were they occupying inland environments, and how dry were these inland environments? Were they extreme adaptations, or were again they occupying them during wetter conditions? So I think there's a lot of exciting work going on in regions that are deserts today, and there remains something interesting to be asked as the degree to which different hominins getting into these greener deserts were having different adaptations at different points in time. An area that's perhaps been less studied in this regard are the desert regions of Central Asia. There's increasing work showing that humans and perhaps other hominins were present in areas in and around the Gobi Desert at different points in time. But whereas the old model used to suggest that humans must have had to avoid these deserts, there is the possibility that during wetter periods again, or during access to lakes, or perhaps with very sophisticated adaptations, humans were able to move directly through these more desertic regions at certain points in time. So again, there's more work, I think, to be done in exploring what exactly were these adaptations like. Moving now to perhaps a different set of extreme environments, looking at palaeoarctic conditions, or just very cold conditions, if you like. There are hints that with a cut mark bone found north of the Arctic Circle, that at different points in time, our species was able to get north of the Arctic Circle, perhaps developing an adaptation to things like the hunting of mammoths and large game that were getting access to plants underneath icy tundra, and then humans extracting the resources basically from these animals that were managing to exploit these colder conditions. Similarly, there's lots of debates, obviously, as to when humans got to the Americas. There's very interesting work coming out of Mexico now that suggests that humans were in there by at least perhaps 30,000 years ago. And there's often been a question, again, did humans arrive and move throughout the Americas as part of a kind of coastal adaptation? Did they wait for an ice-free corridor to form along the Bering Strait? But again, perhaps if we give our ancestors a little more credit, perhaps there's also a way to see how you wouldn't actually necessarily have to have all ice removed for humans to move across this area. And actually, one of the earliest sites in Canada, at least, is found in a northern region that does seem to have very cold period when humans are occupying it. So I think there is also an interesting, again, a need for more understanding of direct on-site records of environments associated with human occupation. Do we have to assume that they either used coastal routes or waited for climate change, or were they actually able to do some things that we perhaps never thought they could have done? This is not just happening in the rest of the world, but even in Europe, we see some interesting changes in distributions of different hominids, perhaps. One of the early Homo sapiens sites, a Paleolithic site Upper Paleolithic site at Breitenbach, with these Venus figurines found as well. It's found right on the edge. You can kind of see beautifully on this left side of the map, right on the edge of where the glaciers moved in Germany. It's right on that point. And the archaeologists, Olaf Joris, for example, think that this might be an adaptation to migrating reindeer that are moving in and out of where would have been glaciated and where not. And that humans are really placing themselves right at this point, this junction between these kind of more extreme glacial conditions. And they're living there throughout glacial periods as well. That this is one adaptation for them to be able to survive there. Again, focusing on certain animals that are able to move through these settings and allowing humans to survive that far north. Another area where we might see cold conditions also in high altitude contexts, and there's also growing evidence that our species was able to inhabit some of these settings as well. So this is sort of the mountain kingdom of Lesotho in southern Africa, and most of the areas above here are over or are mountainous, if you like. And growing work is showing that there is early occupation from around about 75,000 years ago now. We know that humans are living at pretty high altitudes in Lesotho and living in environments that are perhaps what one might call pretty tough, relatively limited nutrients, and they seem to be tracking reliable freshwater resources. And so this remains to be an exciting area to explore as well. How early were humans getting into these mountainous settings, and what were they doing there, and how cold was it is another question as well. We certainly know that humans are surviving in Lesotho through the last glacial maximum, even during very cold periods. And again, it seems to be that they would rather stay in a cold area with reliable access to fresh water than they would to venture out of Lesotho and west, where it would have been very dry at the same time. And there's also been suggestion that particularly at these last glacial maximum sites, humans were making lots of use of freshwater fish as well from these riverine settings. Also, the recent study, you might have seen the Ethiopian highlands, suggesting that humans were inhabiting very cold conditions around about 80,000 years ago in the Ethiopian highlands as well. And certainly outside of Africa, we can see that in the Tibetan plateau, humans had made it up to this very high altitude setting 40 to 30,000 years ago. Although I would say that again, there has been a relative lack of direct insights into what exactly the environments were like at these sites at these given time periods. We also know that humans get pretty quickly into the Andes once they reach South America. And there's certainly evidence for Homo sapiens populations specializing in these settings with genetic influences on the people that still live there today to high altitude environments. So I think coming back to this kind of idea of the generalist specialist, the current evidence would certainly seem to suggest that our species was doing very different things to its predecessors. I think there's no reason to suggest that our predecessors were not doing complex things and doing things pretty flexibly. They were certainly living in different environments, but they didn't make it across the world, at least as far as we know. And they also don't have this evidence for these habitation of very extreme environments as well, at least based on current evidence. By contrast, our species shows from a pretty early time period that will probably only get earlier as we continue to address these questions. In these different extreme environments, from at least about 100,000 years ago, we're seeing these patterns of behavior. And not only is it doing that, but it's doing it with different populations are exploiting very sort of specialized environments. And so this is kind of a sort of schematic of what we meant by this generalist specialist idea, that you have pandas, that their whole population is living in one specific niche. And they're all doing that, all the individuals, they're all specialized in that. Then you have a generalist like a raccoon, or I mentioned the macaque before, where as the species as a whole can do lots of very different things, as can the individuals. They can raid a trash bin, they can go and eat some insects, they can go and eat some fruit. And so different individuals can exploit this whole sort of generalist niche. But in neither of these kind of categories can we fit sort of what we would argue is a relatively unique ecological niche in this context of our species from the late Pleistocene onwards, where you see that not only is the species as a whole exploiting all of these very different environments, but different populations are also able to specialize in them. And this is an undoubted advantage. If you have a population in Sri Lanka, for example, we can now see that there is a population specializing in rainforest resource use, while there is another population living on the coast, and probably another population living in the dry zone. And we can see this because we can see that although isotopically the humans living in the rainforest areas are relying on rainforest resources, they're getting access to things like shark's teeth from the coast. They're getting access to things like open living deer teeth in dry areas. And this must be happening through trade, because we know that these humans were relying on rainforest resources. And so you have a distinct advantage if all of your different populations can live in these very different environments, because if the climate changes, for example, then one of those populations may well disappear or may have problems, as we can see early on that in the human movements out of Africa, that some of them seem to have failed. But the advantage is that while you have different populations doing very different things, as a whole, the species is in a pretty good position to survive through that. And so we would argue that this niche is giving it something a little extra. Now, there are some remaining questions, of course, and some of them I've already alluded to, that, you know, will this is a hypothesis. This is something that we wanted to put forward. It usually leads to quite a lot of fun discussions. It led to a lot of fun discussions with the reviewers as well. But really interesting discussions, really provoking discussions that I think is only going to stimulate more fascinating research. And so one obvious area for exploring is were these Denisovan individuals, looks like they were probably adapted to high altitude settings, unless the only way they weren't is if this site is indeed, the jawbone was not found in situ and has come from somewhere else, or that these genetic sort of traits for high altitude adaptations were non-functional and just by chance appeared, but that seems quite unlikely. But what other environments were they inhabiting? Were they just adapted to these more cooler high altitude settings? They were obviously found at Denisova Cave as well. Were they in the tropics? And this remains to be something interesting that might provide a very interesting avenue for research moving forward. Also been work by Mike Petraglia and Xizha Yang in China, looking at different pre-Homo sapiens hominin adaptations in some parts of China as well. And it certainly seems that, again, these hominins were able to adapt to variable conditions through time. This is the record in the Niawan Basin, for example, and they argue that there is a lot of technological variability that suggests these hominin populations were able to adapt to different settings. But of course, I think what you can see from the scheme below is that, again, there seems to generally be this mixture of forest, woodland, grassland that can, of course, be pretty extreme environments, as we know, anyone who goes hiking or in different areas will know. But they're not quite the same set of environments that, again, our species was eventually exploiting when it came through this area. There's also hints that, we saw the marine adaptations of Neanderthals earlier, but more and more people are now looking into these questions of what were Neanderthal habitats like. There's some suggestions in this paper from Stania Cave in Poland that suggest it could have been very dry and very cold at different points in time. And perhaps also interestingly is that there's arguments that the demise of the Neanderthals eventually was not driven by climate change, but rather competition with humans, which would again suggest that there's not a simple, they weren't simply passive in the face of environmental change. But again, I would still argue that the current evidence suggests that our species is able to adapt, able to have populations living in all these very different environments that gives it a distinct overall advantage to what these other hominins were apparently able to do as well. Of course, the other ultimate question is that if we did find that all these species were inhabiting these different environments, and if we did not only then take into account the genetic evidence that they were interbreeding, but also then making the argument that, well, if they were species all living in these same environments, in these extreme environments, then were they really that different from each other? And so I think there are two directions this could potentially go in, is that either we see that Homo sapiens is indeed upheld to be ecologically, environmentally unique in terms of its flexibility and plasticity, or it isn't. But if it isn't, then we really are left scrambling for anything that makes us unique at all relative to these other hominins. And that is perhaps something that will be interesting either way, however the research goes forward. And I think the one thing that we really wanted to highlight, and I think we can see it happening, is that it's interesting that when we see new fossils published, when we see new amazing material culture published, when we see new genomes published, the environmental context is crucial to looking at what these things actually mean in the context of human evolution and adaptation. And this is really what we wanted to put out there. We don't really care if we're proven wrong. In fact, that would be fascinating, as I've just said. What will that mean then for different hominin adaptations? But I think what's important is that we all start to think about getting better insights of where our archaeological and paleoanthropological records are coming from, and what is the environmental context associated with them. And I think there's a lot of exciting work. You know, Africa, clearly the tropics of Africa is an area that would be great to research, that people have been researching in. Although obviously there are difficulties to doing that, and particularly this is going to be particularly difficult now, but these are all areas where it could be fascinating to explore some of these different adaptations of different hominins, particularly in the case of Africa. Central Asia as well is likely to be a very interesting area for exploring some of these. South America will obviously only tell us sort of about our own species, at least currently. But there is an interesting project by Jose Uriarte at University of Exeter looking at this kind of last journey idea, with the idea that South America is sort of the last continent other than Antarctica that our species gets to, and should give us a beautiful snapshot as to how quickly our species was able to get into the sort of deserts of Peru, the Amazon rainforest, the high altitude Andes. How fast does that happen? What is the process of that out? This sort of part of South America, even in the entrance, primarily working in Colombia, should give us a snapshot into how fast our species is able to do that when it gets there. So that's a very interesting place, I think, where some very fascinating work's going to come out of as well. And then, of course, I think the point is the world, is that a lot of archaeology and paleoanthropological work has often been limited to certain areas, whether it's Africa or Europe or North America, for obviously historical reasons. But that actually, to find what makes us human, it's never, ever going to be enough to look in one region. Because as I would argue, it's actually the smoking gun in what makes us unique is actually our global distribution, that no other hominin has that. And if we don't explore that global distribution and what that global distribution means, then we're not going to get anywhere really at all. And so I think that's the other thing to take away from that too. Of course, this focus on ecology does not mean that we should just ignore these other discussions about things like neuroplasticity, the idea that the human brain, for example, can make a unique, rapid set of connections faster than other hominins perhaps, or questions such as social ornamentation for complex relationships in that regard, things like intergenerational knowledge networks sitting around a fire, or unique technologies such as the bow and arrow. These would all have been crucial in terms of what enabled our species to inhabit these extreme environments, what enabled certain populations to perhaps specialize in certain environments through time. Would obviously be much easier if you have this intergenerational knowledge and effective ways of doing it. If you can communicate with different groups, that gives your species as a whole also greater flexibility. And so this is not at all to say that none of this is relevant, but obviously each of these things is incredibly difficult to find in the archaeological record. We'll probably never, ever find the earliest of any of these things. And so if we're defining our species on the basis of them, it's going to be very hard to find the point at which our species emerges. And yet, if we're looking for changes in the ecological adaptation, there are methodologies that are actually preserved through time. You know, from millions of years ago, this stable isotope approach has been used from 7-10 million years ago, all the way through to the Holocene. So if we take an ecological and environmental perspective, we can actually compare the same data set to some extent for every single hominin in a given region and see how these conditions vary through time. And I think that's something that is perhaps valuable when trying to pinpoint when these behaviors begin and how our species might differ or not. And so these are just some examples. There's obviously the teeth that I've shown you, stable isotope approaches to tooth enamel. Growing methodologies such as zooms has already been shown to be incredibly effective, and paleoproteomics at finding more and more hominins, because really what we ultimately need is more knowledge of which hominins were where and when, and what were the environmental conditions associated with them. And we can only do that if we find more fossils or more material culture, for example, that we can be confident is associated with certain hominins. Things like, obviously, plant remains have often been remarkably little studied in sites in Pleistocene age. And so what kind of resources were they using as well? And I think the biggest focus is to move away from what I would call an off-site climate record. So whether that's a marine core record, an ice core record, or a broader climate model, at least a climate model that isn't constrained by other records, because they're going to tell us fascinating things that are happening at the global scale or the regional scale. But just because the seawater temperature changes doesn't necessarily mean, for example, that a local environment of a population of hominins is changing as well. And so this requires what I would call, and I think we've seen this throughout this talk as well, a set of on-site records, that we have to know what the conditions were like for a hominin at a given point in time and how they change through time. Because we can see that, for example, particularly with the deserts, we can't make assumptions as to what those environments were like in the past. They were probably very different, but how different? How variable were they? This is absolutely crucial to get to explore some of these questions. And so I think we have to really focus, and I think there is an increasing focus on getting on-site environmental records that go alongside these fossils, that go alongside this kind of very interesting material culture, and go alongside these genomes as well. And I think there's also a lot of interesting work being done by Svante Paavo and his team in Leipzig, looking at not just how genomes vary and evidence for interbreeding, but what were some of the functional aspects of some of these genes, right? So we've talked a lot about high altitude adaptations. If we can look at specific genes and what they might have done or not done, then that perhaps gives an avenue again into adaptation that goes a little step beyond just sort of presenting a genome, but looking in how that interacted with the environmental context we may look at as well. And just to end with, there are obviously some caveats when looking at this. I have suggested that the environmental records and ecological records are comparable through time. This is, in principle, could be true, but there are obviously some issues. So this is an example of stable isotope plots of sort of the diets of extinct hominids. On the left-hand side, you have Sivapithecus, Gigantopithecus, and then modern-day chimpanzees and gorillas. Then in the middle, you have sort of classic hominins from Africa. And then on the right-hand side, you have the Sri Lankan humans I mentioned, but also some Southeast Asian humans that are from a Holocene context at the Near Caves as well, done by John Krigbaum. And you can see that broadly, we see that kind of hominins in Africa were probably adapting, at least broadly, through to more open conditions, although the variability is telling that actually there seems to have been a continued reliance on some woodland areas. But none of them get back to this kind of potential specialization that we can see with Homo sapiens in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. That is just one of many adaptations. But obviously one of the problems is when we're looking at this, these different data points represent very different things, right? We're looking at, in the hominins for Africa, we're looking at every single, at the time I put this together, every single hominin value that was available for each of these species, which could be from very different parts of Africa, could represent very broad time periods. Whereas obviously for the case of Sri Lankan Homo sapiens, that represents a period of probably about 35,000 years. And so there are still discrepancies in data sets that mean we have to be careful looking at some of these things. And the final one I think is that a lot of, say, sites for Homo erectus, for example, or some of these non-Homo sapiens ancestors are open air sites. And so they might not preserve some of the records of these things in the same way that we might see for Homo sapiens, that often these sites are in caves, rock shelters, where we get beautiful organic records. So there could potentially be a bias in sampling as well, although I would say that clearly we do have cave records of Homo erectus in Africa. We do have cave records of Homo floresiensis in Southeast Asia. So I'm not convinced that this does counteract what I've been saying, but this is also something worth bearing in mind. Where are we sampling for these different hominins as well? So with that, I'm going to end. So, I mean, usually this leads to quite a fun discussion. I mean, like I say, this is really a hypothesis that we really hope stimulates a lot of future work and a focus on trying to get on-site environmental records associated with these different hominin fossils, because with that, we might be able to get new insights into how our species varied or didn't vary with other hominins. So also big thank you to all of these people, to Nikki Bovan, Department of Archaeology and the Max Planck Society for making all of this research possible, as well as all my close colleagues in Sri Lanka that made that work possible as well, and obviously a lot of other people as well. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening and taking the time out to join today.
Oh, thank you very much. That was such a fascinating talk, and yeah, such an interesting hypothesis. So we'll go into the discussion section now. If you want to stop sharing your screen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we had one question about the recording. So yeah, it will be going up onto the YouTube channel. The links in the chat. So a question from Larry. Given what you say about technological and ecological variability in places like the Niwan Basin pre-sapiens, could the occupation of extreme niches be a response to demographic pressures rather than a specific human capacity?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly possible. That gets back to the sort of chicken and the egg and which comes first. I mean, that's quite difficult to say, although certainly at least one would imagine that when we're looking at Homo sapiens moving out of Africa, when they're arriving in an area at Sri Lanka, it would be surprising to think that they're arriving with such a demographic pressure that would force them to go into the rainforest, for example. So I don't think that that can be the whole story, because particularly at least during the phase outside of Africa. And I mean, it also seems relatively unlikely within Africa. It seems unlikely that humans would have reached carrying capacities in what we have often assumed are preferable environments. And that's what's forcing them to get into these settings. That seems unlikely. But perhaps for these other hominins, so say in the Nihewan Basin in China, perhaps that variability with these other hominin populations is linked to climate change and demographic pressures. Because we do see that particularly ranges of Neanderthals, for example, change through different glacial periods and beyond. So perhaps I think that's something that, again, is relatively hard to investigate, but I would be surprised if it was the whole story.
Okay. Matt has a couple of questions. In your opinion, what is the difference between a generalist specialist species and a plastic species? Do you think that specialist capacities of the former are purely cultural?
Yes, that's a really interesting one. I mean, like I said, this is a relatively jargonistic term, but I think it illustrates, I mean, a plastic species, what would make a plastic species, I guess, different from a really good generalist is the point. And so that I think would, plastic species is obviously, I suppose a plastic species is one that doesn't necessarily have to sit in its own niche and can respond to very different things very quickly, which is obviously a key capacity. And that's what would probably separate it from a generalist. But we would argue that perhaps doesn't quite capture this, what we see in terms of these, that there are populations that literally are specializing in a rainforest in Sri Lanka for 35,000 years. Is that purely cultural? That is a very good question. I mean, it's really exciting what we're seeing in Sri Lanka, that even within what is a relatively small island, we can now see that there are groups living in the coast. There are groups living in the open, more grassland setting, likely. We don't have necessarily very good direct evidence for them yet, but through what we're seeing in exchange, it looks like that exists. And so you do have different groups that are living. And the fact that some of these items like shark's teeth, like deer teeth are being traded as part of this does suggest that there's a cultural element going on to it, that there are close relationships to specific environments. But again, it's very hard to say when humans first rocked up in Sri Lanka, what made them go into these different environments is very hard to say. Did it come first? Was it a cultural idea of inhabiting these different settings, or was it something else? As Larry said, was it demography driving them into different areas? I mean, the thing we know at the moment is that our earliest firm evidence comes from the rainforest, which is surprising given what most people would say in terms of perhaps, if you were doing basic foraging theory, you would expect them to perhaps go first into the dryland environment. So do we not have them there first because we don't have the evidence? That's possible. Or are they going to the rainforest for some other region? I mean, it's also possible, I think maybe highly likely, that the Western Ghats rainforests actually extended down into Sri Lanka at a point in time. And so there may have been actually, ironically, a rainforest corridor that could have actually seen people that were adapted to rainforest adaptations in India moving into Sri Lanka. So yeah, I mean that's the fascinating set of questions, and certainly these cultural and demographic questions need to be discussed as well. It's not to say that they're not relevant, but it's hard to, I guess, put them in order. But that I think that if we can apply these techniques in different sites, in good close context with different hominin species, we can get interesting insights into how ecological adaptations are changing through time that we perhaps can't get so clearly from cultural evidence, that we'll never get the earliest of, or we'll never get a broader picture of, because we see how complex it is, that it comes and goes and comes back. So I think that's why I think the ecological environmental side is such an interesting area to explore in that regard, if that makes sense.
John Gowler asks, should this encourage us to look harder at some earlier time slices to be surer of what earlier humans could and couldn't do? That is, could they get around a lot of the world but not be able to cope with certain environments?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, one of the things is in Southeast Asia, we don't have any isotopic evidence from Homo erectus or Homo floresiensis yet. Well, there is some isotopic evidence from Homo erectus bone carbonate, but I wouldn't really trust that. It's not very reliable. You know, it needs to be the teeth really. And so, yeah, for example, you know, if we do the isotopes on them, it may turn out that actually they were rainforest specialists as well, which would completely obviously change the angle. And so I think, you know, there has been a long history, particularly in Africa, of looking at some of these questions. And obviously this hypothesis is not necessarily new, right? Matt has been doing similar things, and Potts before him has done very similar, you know, had similar questions about variability and what's driving hominin evolution. And Africa has a long history of looking at these environmental changes, but the rest of the world not so. There's often been like, you know, when is the earliest fossil in this region, or when is the earliest example of this in this region, and not kind of how are these things appearing in an environmental context, right? What is driving these different things? And so, yes, I think absolutely there is a need to look at some of these questions. Some of these areas we just don't have the data for, right? So that, you know, there's been, you know, we're missing sites in some of these areas that could be crucial. You know, Central Africa and West Africa are fascinating, have to be an area that are going to emerge as fascinating regions. But obviously a lot of difficulty working, and a lot of the site sequences are sort of hinting, but then issues with chronology or issues with environmental context make them difficult to tease apart. But they're going to be fascinating areas for investigation in the future, for example, for not only our species, but also what went before. Yeah.
Okay, I think that is all the questions that we have. And yeah, it's almost 2:10, so I guess we'll round it up there. So thank you very much, Patrick, for that. That was absolutely wonderful. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming. And see you all next week for a webinar by Karis, my co-organizer. So yeah, see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you very much for the invite, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Take care.